This is Mishnah in Depth, Shevuot, where we have had the pleasure of learning these past 5 weeks with Shalhevet Schwartz, and we're meeting this one last time in as Drisha it follows the Mishnah Yomit schedule. This class and our other Mishnah in Depth programming is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This, as with previous weeks, this class is assuming that you are independently following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, learning when to do mishnayot on your own, and we are coming together to review, look in depth, look at more interesting things. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to you, Shalhevet.
Thanks so much, Kayla, and hi again to those who I see on the screen, and looking forward to learning with you one last time. I'll say thanks to you all again at the end, but it's really been a pleasure learning with you thus far. Okay, so what we are going to be doing today is we're going to take a look at really the last three prakim of Masechet Shevuot, despite the fact that I know that the Mishnah Yomit schedule really only has everyone at around the beginning of the 8th parak right now, and next week, because I imagine because of Purim or whatever, we will not be learning together, but hopefully just even without having learned the parak Shevuot Shomrim, things should be clear and make sense anyway. What we're going to do today, I think as usual, we're going to start with a kind of brief summary of some of the kind of major points that come up over the course of these three prakim, and then we're going to discuss, we're actually going to try to get to the bottom of really what is the purpose, or what are the purposes of the different Shevuot HaDayanim, of the different courtroom oaths, the oaths that are taken by that are taken as part of courtroom procedure. So yeah, we're going to explore the question of really what those oaths are for. Who are they for? Are they in order to determine the truth of the matter, or are they really about something else? Are the litigants actually supposed to swear, in fact, or are they supposed to respond to their to the oath incumbent upon them in some other way? And as a part of how we're going to explore that question, I think what's going to emerge is this is a really, I think, a cool opportunity to see a way that a seemingly odd rabbinic innovation, perhaps, on the biblical text that seems to be kind of counterintuitive and bizarre, actually, upon further reflection, I think we'll see together that I think it reflects what is already a kind of oddity or a kind of question that emerges out of the biblical text itself. And we're also going to see how, hopefully, kind of use the answers that the rabbinic tradition offers for that question as a way of thinking about broader questions about the purpose of the justice system more broadly, and really what we're trying to do when we come to court to settle cases. So with that introduction, let us begin. I'm going to share my screen. Right, the prakim that we are dealing with now are what is highlighted in blue here. The prakim really about Shevuot HaDayanim. This slide is actually from our first shiur. For those of us who have been with us from the beginning, as we talked about the structure of the Masechet more generally, we pointed out that the final three prakim really are answering a fundamentally different question about Shevuot than the middle three. Right, these prakim are asking under what conditions a litigant is legally required to take an oath. Right, these are the oaths that are part of courtroom procedure, and right, that this is what gets covered in our parak, and the kinds of oaths that get covered in these prakim. Really, there are 4/3, depending on how you count. So the parak Vav, right, the 6th chapter, really is about Shevuot Modeh B'Miktzat, right, the oath of partial admission. So if someone lends me money, and then says, "Where are the $50,000 I lent you?" And I said, "What do you mean? You only lent me $25,000." That's Shevuot Modeh B'Miktzat. The 7th chapter, parak Zayin, deals with the cases of the Nishba'im V'Notlim, the plaintiffs who take an oath. Usually, Shevuot HaDayanim are taken by the defendant. These are taken by the plaintiff, and they're taken under conditions when, for some reason, the defendant can't, shouldn't, or something take an oath. These, although it's not stated explicitly in the Mishnah, it becomes clear in the Gemara that these oaths are rabbinic, like they're rabbinic innovations. These oaths, they're not a Shevuot deoraita, they're Shevuot derabanan. Then we've got the last parak, which deals with Shevuot HaShomrim, right? This is the guardians over a deposit, a pikadon, right? Something that someone is keeping watch over for someone else, and then something happens to that object. The person takes an oath that they were not negligent or responsible in some other way for the fact that something bad happened to that object. There's an additional Shevuot HaDayanim that doesn't show up or actually it does a little bit show up in the 7th parak. It's kind of hidden there. I don't know if anyone noticed it. In the case of if people were following along with the mishnayot, one of the cases of the nishba'im v'notlim is the pogemet ktubata, the person who admits to having partially paid off already her ketubah. So in addition to that, the Mishnah brings a case of there being one witness that the ketubah has already been paid. So that's Eid Echad in the Mishnah, even though it's not really present in most places. But usually, someone claims that I owe them $100. I say, "What are you talking about?" That in and of itself is not enough to render me responsible to pay, or even to take an oath, midoraita. But if they have one witness on their side who says that I am indeed chayavet, then I too will have to take a shvuah. It's interesting that doesn't really show up in the Mishnah. It shows up all over the Gemara. It's an interesting question that we're going to put in parentheses for now. I don't really think we're going to have time, unfortunately, to deal with it today. But when we learn Gemara on Masechet Shevuot together, we can think about that question. Okay. Very briefly, the Shevuot Modem Miktzat, a couple of principles of this oath that we see in the 6th parak as they show up, right? It's on a loan as opposed to a deposit, right? A milveh as opposed to a pikadon, right? A pikadon you have to swear on even if you don't admit to owing any of it, right? Even if the entire thing, let's say, was I took an animal and it died or something like that. It requires both, right? The way that the Mishnah used the language of ad yehei hoda'a b'miktzat v'kfira b'miktzat, or the Gemara, right? It requires both admission to part of it and denial of part of it. Meaning, if someone says that I owe them X amount of money, I have to agree that I do in fact owe them at least part of it, and I have to deny that I owe them part of it in order for me to be required to take that oath. And it requires what ends up taking up a lot of space in this parak, for those of you who are following along, hoda'a mimin hata'ana, which is to say the admission has to be of the same genre, type, something of the sort, as what is being claimed. So here, some examples of what constitutes hoda'a mimin hata'ana, right? The question of if someone claims gold, if someone claims that I owe them gold and I only say that I owe them silver, right? It might depend in that case on whether what we're talking about is currency, because what's the difference in gold, silver, and gold currency and silver currency? It's all currency, as opposed to if someone says, "You owe me a hunk of gold," and I say it's just silver. Right? The question of here, there's a lot, right? The question that the Mishnah tends to be asking is, right, does the thing that he admitted to fall under the category of the thing that the plaintiff was claiming? So the question of, various species of food items that someone may have been claiming. A fun example is someone claims a full jug, that they're owed full jugs of oil, and someone responds that hodalo bakankanim. They admitted that I in fact borrowed jugs, but I borrowed empty jugs. So the question is, were you suing me for the jugs and the oil, or just for the oil primarily? So these are some of the questions about what constitutes hoda'a mimin hata'ana. We see an important rabbinic principle about the kinds of things that we don't take we don't take oaths over. Meaning the kinds of things that if someone says you owe me this thing, right, you cannot be right, the defendant is not liable to take an oath. And these categories, they're just important because they show up all over the rabbinic tradition in other contexts too, not just with regard to oaths. also with regard to how the halachic tradition thinks about theft and various other things. So the examples here are shtarot, right, documents, karkaot, land, and avadim, slaves. And for Rabbi Meir, kol mechubar lakarka adds that kol mechubar lakarka harezik karka talks about grapevines that may have been that are almost to be picked. So that's largely what happens in the sixth parak. A lot of what happens in the seventh parak, right? These cases of nishba'im v'notlim, the people who are swearing and collecting, the plaintiffs who end up having to take oaths. Basically, more or less, the reason why a plaintiff would have to take an oath is because for some reason we don't either trust or want the defendant to take an oath, right? The defendant would, under different circumstances, perhaps be the one to take an oath, but here, right, they can't for some reason. So one example is the day laborer, right? Because and this gets further fleshed out in the Gemara itself, but the assumption is that an employer doesn't really necessarily, an employer who's hiring a lot of day laborers doesn't necessarily remember who he pays when, and so might think that he already paid this day laborer for the day's work, but is not actually sure. And so instead we have the laborer himself come and say, I was not yet paid, take an oath, and then collect. We have a case of, an injured or a robbed party, right? The nechbal and the nigzal, someone who we see that someone went into their house and took something, but we don't know what it is they took or how much they took, or we see that someone beat someone up and we're not totally sure what the value of that was. So the injured party, who's the plaintiff in this case, takes the oath about how much, or right, about the content of the injury, and then collects. And finally, the chenvani al pin kaso, which is a sort of kind of wacky fun case where you have three parties and there's a sort of circle of where the money is supposed to go around for those. And what ends up being the case is I tell Saul, who's a shopkeeper, who keeps an account book. I tell Saul to I hand him a bunch of money and I say, can you give it to my son over there? Then I come back the next day and say, did this happen? And you say, yeah, of course it happened. Or I say this to you before I give you the money. And you say, yeah, of course I paid your son. Now pay up. But the son says, I never got the money. So the question is, how does that work? So he swears, the son swears. The son collects from him, he collects from me, and I lose out. Except for there's a Tana who disagrees with this. Sure, it's just a fun case. All right, the final parak really deals with the liability of the four guardians. The Arba Shomrim deals with the different levels of liability, and then based on the different levels of liability, what kinds of claims and counterclaims, right? What kinds of claims require an oath, and what kinds of false claims, in light of that, end up being considered Shevuot Pikadon. This parak structurally is very similar in some ways to parak Hey, which we discussed last week about Shevuot Pikadon, where and Shevuot Ha'idut, where like a big question that this parak is dealing with is the question of the stakes of the claim that the person is making. I don't know, show of hands, have any of you guys learned Bava Metzia before? Because it's I was getting some nods, some head shaking. So those of you who have learned Bava Metzia, there is a lot of shared content. I think one of the reasons why this parak actually, it's in some ways kind of sparse, and in the Gemara it's even more sparse, because a lot of the meat of this parak really exists back in Bava Metzia, particularly in the third parak. But this kind of goes over some of those principles again, and then tells you a little bit about their specifics with regard to Shevuot. So we have four different Shomrim who are each have a different level of responsibility based on kind of how much they're doing a favor for the owner versus the owner is doing a favor for them, right? Someone who's agreeing to guard another person's object with no use rights to it and is not getting paid for it is going to be responsible in fewer cases than someone who borrows another person's object with full rights to use it for free. So right, everyone in a case in which I am negligent with an object, or I am kind of or I misuse the object on purpose, something happens to it, I destroy it, whatever. In those cases, no matter what, I obviously have to pay. In a case of loss or theft, which is seen as a kind of usual sort of thing that fairly expected thing that could happen. Specifically, the shomer chinam, the guy who's watching the other person's object for free, he's off the hook, but everyone else has to pay. And in the case of onus, which is like really the classic cases are injury, capture, or death of an animal, but things that are really unexpected or out of the blue, everyone is exempt except for the shoel. So how does it work with the shvuah? Right, let's say John comes and says that I was the shomer chinam for his cow or something, and he says that I misused it, and I say I didn't misuse it, but rather it was stolen. So in that case, right, I would be moving from he claimed that I was liable to pay. I claimed and swore that essentially I was not liable to pay. Therefore, right, that under those circumstances, that would be the kind of oath that I would have to take in court, a Shevuot HaShomrim. And if I did take it, I would be liable for Shevuot HaPikadon. So fundamentally, the principle, and I think there will be some arrows that appear here, right, in these cases, in a case where the claim that is made against me, the arrows, I don't know if this is a helpful image or confusing, but like the box where the arrow starts is what the plaintiff is claiming. The plaintiff is claiming this thing happened, and the box where the arrow goes to is the claim that the defendant is making. So in any of those cases where what the plaintiff is claiming and what the defendant is counterclaiming, in cases where it doesn't make a difference as to the question of whether I'm liable to pay or not, I don't have to take an oath. And if I do take an oath and it's false, I'm not chayav for Shevuot HaPikadon, as we saw in Perek K, stakes. And if I am, like, if it does make a difference, then I am liable to take this oath, and if I do, it is considered a bona fide Shevuot HaPikadon, and my liability as kind of follows. That makes sense? Can I get like some nods if that was coherent? Okay, because this stuff is probably the things that you haven't seen yet. So good luck learning. It's fun. Okay. With that, I think that's really we've sort of covered the major ground of those three prakim, and now I think I want to take a step back and to think a little bit about really what this shvuah or what these shvuot are for. Right? We've seen a couple of different kinds. I'm going to let go for a moment. I think most of the time what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this shiur is going to be Shevuot HaShomrim and Shevuot Modeh Mitzat, because they're the biblical oaths that take up a lot of space in these prakim. And the question, right, there's a lot of interesting work to be done with the Nishba'im v'Notlim, the Derabanan oaths, but I think we're gonna leave them mostly aside for now. And unfortunately, Eid Echad really doesn't show up too much. So really, we're going to focus on the other two. And I want to start, as I think it is often good to do, by going back to the biblical text, to really the source of the idea of Shevuot HaDayanim, of a Shevuah that the Torah commands us to take in court. Okay? So this is sort of where it all begins. We've seen these psukim a couple of times. These are not the psukim in Vayikra that we've also seen a million times. These are the psukim in Parashat Mishpatim. I think it says Shemot Kaf Bet here. It might be Shemot Kaf Aleph. I might have written that wrong. But anyway, these are the psukim in Parashat Mishpatim, and it would be great if someone wanted to volunteer to read in either Hebrew or English, your language of choice. Feel free to either raise your hand or just hop in. John, it looks like you unmuted yourself. Was that a volunteer? Okay.
Ki iten ish el re'ehu kesef ochelim lishmor v'gunav mi beit ha'ish im yimatza haganav yishalem shnayim. Im lo yimatza haganav v'nikrav ba'al habayit el ha'elohim im lo shalach yado b'melechet re'ehu.
Okay, amazing. Do you mind just reading the English as well?
When any party gives money or goods to another for safekeeping, and they are stolen from that other party's house, if caught, the thief shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall depose before Elohim and deny laying hands on the other's property. Okay,
so that's so far. Right, we've got someone who is keeping kesef or kelim, right, money or goods for someone else. The picture that the Torah gives us right now is it gets stolen, and either you find or you don't find the thief. Find the thief, good, story's over, go home. Don't find the thief. Then what happens? Nikrav bal habayit el ha'elohim im lo shalach edo b'mlechet re'eh. So the person who was holding onto the object, right, he deposed. Nikrav really probably means approaches el ha'elohim, which basic reading you would say means, someone can just shout it out if you want.
Judges.
Okay, John's saying judges. Any other options?
God.
Okay, thanks, John. Those I would say are the two broader options. I'll have you know, John, for what it's worth, that the translation that I was taking it from did translate it as God, which I'm not. I also think that it's unclear, and this is, I think, one of the things that will that kind of one of the many sort of questions that emerges from the text as we look at it, and we'll see the continuation, right? Whether what we're talking about means going before, right? The word Elohim can mean like judges, leaders, something like that, or it can also refer to God, right? Like master or something, yeah. And so it looked like you were going to say something.
Well, it's the third person, right? Melchas Re'ehu. He's not saying it to the person accusing him, who gave it to him. He has to be saying it to somebody else or to himself.
Ah, interesting. So, okay, one possible, right? You're noticing the Melechet Re'ehu, right? The fact that the Torah there is speaking in third person, right? One possibility in terms of how I would respond to that is that it could be that just like this isn't in quotation marks. We're not necessarily saying the Baal Habayit says, I did not lay my hand on this other person's property, because it also says his hand, right? It could be that the Torah is speaking in a zoomed out way. But I think one of the things that you're noticing is that I think this might be true even if the Torah had phrased it a little bit differently, right? Or at least the Torah here certainly is leaving it ambiguous. If there is an oath here, right? If the Elohim that we're talking about means God, it's not clear, right? The oath that the Baal Habayit is taking it's not clear whether he's taking it to the owner or to the court, right? Even if it's an oath, it's not clear who the recipient of that oath is. And I think that's actually a really important question that is going to kind of hold on to that question for kind of, and we'll see how it plays out. So let's keep reading. John, do you mind keep going?
Sure. Al kol devar pesha, al shor, al chamor, al seh, al salma, al kol aveda asher yomar ki hu zeh ad ad ha'elohim yavod devar shnehem asher yarshi'un Elohim yishalem shnaim l're'ehu.
Okay, awesome. Can you do the English for me as well?
In all charges of misappropriation pertaining to an ox, an ass, a sheep, a garment, or any other loss, whereof one party alleges, this is it, the case of both parties shall come before Elohim. The one whom Elohim declares guilty shall pay double to the other.
Okay, excellent. I don't know where that closed parentheses came from, but it must have been a leftover from some translation. Okay. Right, so what we have is a kind of broader principle, right? This is not only true of Kesef or Kelim, it's true about everything. We have this interesting phrase, Asher Yomar Ki Hu Zeh, about which a party alleges this is it. Interesting. We have this character or characters of Elohim, their identity being uncertain. And then, right, we have at the end, Asher Yarshi'un Elohim Yishalem Shnaim L'Re'eh. So the bad guy's going to have to pay. And now we have another similar case, and here it's going to be very explicit that what we're talking about is an oath. So, John, this is the final piece, and these 5 psukim all come in a row, right? This is one chunk of text that shows up in Parashat Mishpatim. Okay.
Yiten ish el rehu chamor o shor o seh v'chol be'ema lishmor umet o nishbar o nishba en ro'ah. Shevuot Hashem tiyeh.
I appreciate the feminism there. It is ro'ed. You're right that there's a little line there that's just
yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it's all good. I think the line is the sof pasuk. Okay, keep going.
Shvat Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem im lo shalach yado b'melecha rehu v'lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem.
Okay, so we see a similar picture to the one that appeared earlier with the kesef or kelim. For what it's worth, the earlier psukim that we saw, the way the rabbinic tradition understands them is as describing a shomer chinam, and these two psukim are the ones that the rabbinic tradition understands as describing as shomer sachar. I'm realizing, John, you didn't read the translation, did you? Which is not your fault; it's mine. So I'm gonna ask you to do that too.
When any party gives to another an ass, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to guard, and it dies or is injured or is carried off with no witnesses about, oath before the Lord shall decide between the two of them that the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. The owner must acquiesce, and no restitution shall be made.
Excellent. Okay. Right. So the case is very similar to the above. The thing that happens in the case above is that it gets stolen. Here, what happens is the object gets killed or injured or something, which is how the rabbinic tradition understands the different levels of responsibility for a shomer chinam and a shomer sachar. But we're gonna kind of hold back on that for a second because I want to kind of remain in the pshat as much as we can. Here, it's very clear that what's happening is a shvuah. It says so. Shevuot Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem. Also interesting, right? The words this perhaps gets at Saul's thing, right? Saul, what are you noticing about the language there?
Well, the owner has to agree.
What does it mean for the owner must acquiesce? It's an interesting. I think it's also an interesting translator's choice. V'lakach be'alav literally means like the owner has to take it, which is to say, once you rule against the owner, meaning you rule against there shall be an oath between the two of them. The thing that I thought you might notice was just that the oath is said to be between the two of them, right? As opposed to there being a kind of anonymous third party who's listening. This seems to be about the two parties and their relationship with each other, perhaps.
But isn't there a larger point that only here does it specifically say shvuah? And in the previous cases, it has to do with what he articulates, and it's not mentioned shvuah.
Okay.
We may interpolate it, but it's not in the text.
Right. So I think you're right, and in that I think here the meaning here it's clear that there's an explicit shvuah, and there it's definitely not explicit. Whether it's implicit is going to be the question that the rabbis are going to be dealing with, and the rabbis are going to say not only that it's implicit, but that there's another one that's implicit there too that you didn't even realize. They're going to understand the term v'nikrav Baal Habayit el Elohim, right? That the Baal Habayit approaches Elohim, right? They're going to read that in light of what's down here, Shevuot Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem, and they're going to say that both are referring to the same thing, which is a Shevuah. Saul wants to say, and I think rightly that like if the Torah used different language to describe what's happening, then perhaps that too is meaningful. One of the things that I think we'll see as we keep going is that if we really pay attention, we'll see that the difference, right, the different tone and the different tenor isn't necessarily right. Let's say I divided this into 3 slides. So you might tell me slides 1 and 2, right? They're both about go to Elohim and see what see what happens, and then slide 3 is different because there's an explicit oath. But I think that we'll see that maybe there's a different way that we might want to break it down, or might prefer to break it down, and that might be what's behind a little bit of kind of the funky hermeneutic derivations that end up taking us into our Mishnah. Okay. So far so good. Those are the psukim. If we go back to our question at all the different kinds of Shevuot that we have here, on its face, what is the kind of Shevuah that we just saw of this list? And someone can just shout it out if you wanna.
Shomrim.
Yep. Right. So the oath that we see Shevuot Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem, it explicitly at least is referring to Shevuot HaShomrim. Shevuot Eid Echad, which again barely gets mentioned in the Mishnah, is learned in a funky midrash halacha from Eid Echad, Lo Yakum Eid Echad Leish. Bracket that for now. But the question that the Gemara really deals with actually a number of times, and that we already see in the Midrash Halacha about, right, is where does Shevuot Modeh B'Miktzat come from? Modeh B'Miktzat, right, we saw is about a loan, not about a deposit, right, not about an object that gets kind of handed to me, but about someone lends me money, I don't have to pay them back that precise object. Doesn't matter if something happens, right? If Emily lends me money, I don't have to pay back the exact coins that she gave me. I just doesn't matter if those coins get stolen or something happens to them or who knows what. I now owe her $1,000 and I have to just pay her back out of something. So where does Modeh B'Miktzat come from? And that's going to be a question that we'll see the rabbis end up locating it also in our psukim. Okay? So can I get a different volunteer to read this Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael on Asher Yomar Ki Hu Zeh, which was that kind of curious phrase in the middle that John read for us before.
I can read.
Thanks, Emily.
Asher Yomar Ki Hu Zeh, Shezeh Omer Zehu v'Zeh Omer Einohu. Mikan Amru Ad Shetihei Hoda'a B'Miktzat HaTa'ana.
Okay. Thank you. And can you do the English also?
About which he says, this is it. One says, this is it, and the other says, this is not it. From here, the rabbi said, one is not liable to take an oath until there is an admission to part of the claim.
All right. Okay. So first of all, this is a kind of clearly midrashic form of exegesis, right? It's not the literal words ki hu zeh, it is not clear, at least explicitly, how that means an admission to part of the claim. But the rabbis take those words ki hu zeh, right, which seem to reflect a kind of like a conflict as to whether, right, the nature of the thing being claimed, as the source for Hoda'a B'Miktzat HaTa'ana. There has to be admission to part of the claim. Now, what's challenging about this? A number of things are challenging about this, and I can imagine that some of you will be challenged by just the fact of this kind of this exegesis in the first place. But I want to sort of add another layer of challenging about this, which is, right, ki hu zeh, right, that this phrase is found in the middle of what seemed to be a kind of long exploration of Shevuot HaShomrim, right? I'm guarding a pikadon for somebody else, and then the pasuk says about anything for which the person says ki hu zeh, right? If you imagine the actual biblical image of what's happening right, is someone comes to the other person's house and says, "Where's the Xbox I lent you?" or whatever it is, and then and looks inside the house and says, "Hey, look, it's that thing," and the other guy's like, "What are you talking about? I bought that one from Walmart by myself," right? It seems like it's part of the picture about Shevuot HaPikadon. And there actually is an opinion in the Gemara that thinks that, right, that thinks that's true, that ad shetehei hoda'a b'miktzat hata'ana, until there is an admission to part of the claim, is a condition of Shevuot HaShomrim, right? Even a guardian of an object, in order to take a Shevuot on it, has to admit to owing part of that object. And then you get all these kind of bizarre cases of there having been 3 cows that I borrowed, and then, like, I said one of them died and one of them I was negligent with, and so here I can owe you that money. It's a very kind of bizarre picture. But the prominent picture that we saw also throughout the Mishnah is that actually, no, Hoda'a B'Miktzat HaTa'ana is referring to a totally different kind of thing, a totally different kind of oath than Shevuot HaShomrim. Okay? And what we see there, and right, the way that gets articulated is something that Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef says. I think kind of both very famous and kind of very bizarre exegetical claim about what's going on in these psukim. Would someone maybe Emily? You only read a couple lines last time, so if you're willing to give this one a go as well.
Amar Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, Eruv parashiot katuv kan, v'chi ktiv ki hu zeh, amilva hu dichtiv.
And then English, yeah.
A merging of Torah portions is written here, and the halacha written in this passage is in fact meant to be applied to a different passage when it is written, this is it, from which the halacha of partial admission is derived. It is written concerning a loan, not a deposit.
Okay. So I can tell that you're already enjoying this, Emily, which is to say that, right, Rabbi Chia bar Yosef is claiming, actually, what we're supposed to do is cut and paste this pasuk out of this section and paste it probably about 15 psukim below, at the point in Parashat Mishpatim when they start talking about loans, which is later, not immediately afterwards, certainly not here, right? The key huzeh from which we learn this whole idea of hoda'ah v'miktzat is actually referring not to a pikadon, not to a deposit, but to a milva, to a loan. That is Rabbi Chia bar Yosef's claim, and I think as many of as my first instinct when I saw this was I think there's something kind of fishy and confusing about it. It's not that often, right? We see in narrative portions in the Torah what you get a kind of Rashi ein mukdam u'achar b'Torah, but you don't usually see, oh, this piece of a legal text that seems like it's referring to this is actually referring to something totally different that belongs in another place, and it doesn't even apply to the thing that you thought it applied here. It's a very this statement of Chia bar Yosef shows up in a number of places, and it seems to be accepted lahalacha, right? The way that we all saw the Mishnah, the way that we understand Shevuot Modeh Mitzat is about loans, and right, that's why you need things that are a davar shebimidah mishkal minyan for those who are following in the for those who are following the mishnayot. And a pikadon, right, a person who is taking an oath, a guardian's oath, a Shevuot HaShomrim, takes that oath even when he's denying that he owes any money, right? Says the entire thing, I borrowed your cow, it died, or not borrowed, let's say I was watching your cow and it died unexpectedly. So I think, right, this question of what is Rabbi Chia bar Yosef saying? Why is he saying it? And what ultimately is he getting at? Right, I think that's going to be the question that we're gonna try to kind of explore and break down together. And in order to do that, I want us to kind of think when it comes. We're going to go back to these psukim about Shevuot HaShomrim for a second, and I want us to think about really what does it seem like kind of the purpose of the oath is, as it shows up explicitly. What does it seem like the purpose of the oath is? Okay, yeah. Sorry, this is just maybe this is just an indicator of the kind of bizarreness of what's going on, right? This is all about the pikadon, that's about the milva. But yeah, so what we're gonna try to understand what the purpose of the oaths are. We're gonna go back to the psukim and we're gonna think about it. We're gonna think about it with regard to Shevuot HaShomrim. We're gonna think about a couple of questions. One is going to be, what is the strength of the plaintiff's claim? By which I mean, what does the plaintiff think? What does the plaintiff know? When the plaintiff comes and says, I think you owe me the $100 I lent you, versus I think you owe me this cow that I lent you, right? What's the nature of what they're demanding and what they're claiming? We're gonna kind of ask, and this is gonna be true with both Shevuot Modeh Mitzat and Shevuot HaShomrim, right? Is there really a dispute about the facts here, or is what's happening something else? And then this kind of final question of is the instinct of the Torah or the instinct of the rabbis to say that we think the defendant's telling the truth, or rather not. Right? So I want us to ask these questions. We're going to kind of go back to we're going to think about it in the context of the case of Shevuot HaShomrim, right? A normal case in which someone is putting something in my safekeeping, asking for it back. I claim that something happened to it, right? And I take an oath. We're going to think about it with regard to that case. And we're going to think about it with regard to the case of the Shevuot Modeh Mitzat, a case of a loan for which, I'm responsible to pay you back in full no matter what happens to the object, because it's not about the object itself, but in which I deny, in fact, owing you that full amount and instead claim to only owe you a part of that amount. So we're going to do that for Shevuot HaShomrim and Shevuot Modeh Mitzat. We're going to see how the answers actually seem to be a little bit different. And then we're gonna maybe kind of relocate that tension already in the psukim itself. Sound good? Okay. So just going back to this pasuk about, right, the psukim about that explicitly mention Shevuot HaShomrim, right? We're gonna take the second case for now. Although I think we could do the same thing process-wise with the first case, with the Kesef Okilim. But here we're gonna the Chamor Oseh. So what is the Torah? How does the Torah frame this story? Right? What happened? What happened? Right? Someone gives someone else something to guard, and then right, the Torah is starting with the conclusion of, right, what the almost like what the verdict is. What happened? Meit onishba ve'ein roeh. Right? Something bad happened to the animal, and nobody saw it. So then you get this Shvuat Hashem bein shnehem im lo shalach yado b'lechet re'ehu. Right? There shall be this oath oath here. It really the Hebrew is if, even though the English says that. The one has not laid hands on melechet re'eh, on the property of the other. V'lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem. Yes, all?
Well, in that case, they both agree because they both understand that something bad happened to the animal. That's what the Torah means when it says that. Because if they don't fundamentally agree, you can't handle the case.
So I think you've hit it exactly, like hit the nail on the head in that what's happening here is not, right, it's not really a dispute, right? What's happening is if let's say it's my cow and I gave it to Saul to watch, and Saul says something really bad happened to this cow. I don't know for a fact that that Saul's lying. I in fact have no reason to believe really that Saul is lying. In fact, I chose to leave my cow with him, so chances are I probably more or less trust him. In general, and this is kind of just like step back for a second. In terms of oaths, claims, and counterclaims, there's a general principle in halacha that you don't, under most circumstances, what's called the halacha makes a distinction between what is called a ta'anat bari and a ta'anat shema. Are those phrases familiar to anyone? So a ta'anat, so the term bari means like certain or sure, and the term shema means perhaps or lest. So is the claim, right, I am certain that this thing happened, or I'm certain that you owe me money, I'm certain that whatever, or is the claim, you might owe me money? So usually, so in those kinds of cases, right, a broad kind of halachic principle tends to be that, right, is that bari v'shema, bari adif. So if there's, right, a person saying that they're sure and versus a person saying that they're unsure, so the sure person wins the day. So in general, we don't necessarily take oaths on what I would call a ta'anat shema, right? A claim that perhaps something happened, but Shevuot HaShomrim is kind of, by definition, a ta'anat shema, right? It is definitionally, right? The plaintiff himself has no real claim. Right, so the plaintiff's claim, it's not certainty. If anything, right, it's maximally just suspicion. Saul might say it's not even necessarily suspicion so much. It's just a kind of wanting to check off a box and sleep more easily at night. Right, is there in fact a dispute about the facts of the case? Saul pointed it out before. Probably not. There's no real counterclaim, right? Or there's no real claim actually. The plaintiff and the defendant. Even calling them plaintiffs and defendants in this instance is probably is almost like a kind of over a stretch in terms of describing what's really happening. And do we think that the defendant's telling the truth? Ultimately, it seems like the answer to that seems to be yes, right? The biblical narrator seems to think that the defendant is telling the truth, right? The way that the biblical narrator narrates the case is, right, it starts out with, oh yeah, the thing that the defendant is going to swear to, in fact, happened. Meit nishbar nishba ein roeh. That's what happened. And then he takes an oath about it, and then the owner of the object is just okay with it and goes home, and shalom al Yisrael. Everyone's happy. So that seems to be the picture, right, that we get here. If we think for a second about a case of modeh b'mikzat, which is to say a loan, that someone lends me money and says, where is that money that I lent you? And I say, what are you talking about? I only owe you half of that money, right? What we end up seeing is a very different picture, right? The picture, but just one step back for a second. I forgot about this. The most explicit articulation of what we just said about Shevuot HaShomrim is actually articulated in the Gemara in the third parak above Mitzia. I'll just read it quickly because, right, I'll just read the bold part because its place in the back and forth of the Gemara is not necessarily worth getting into. Right, the Shevuah here is kedei lehafis da'ato shel baal habayit. The point of this oath is to alleviate the concerns of the owner, to calm his nerves, kind of lehafis da'ato shel baal habayit. And right, so when we think about Shevuot HaShomrim and what it is, and this even seems to be true to the biblical text. This Shevuah is bein shnehem. It's between the two of them, right? It's something that the defendant kind of offers to the plaintiff in order to kind of calm him to let him rest easy at night. But yeah, but Shevuot b'mikzat, the facts are different. The picture is entirely different, and we see this kind of most eloquently articulated by Rabbah. Rabbah is a third generation Amora, so he's a rabbi already kind of in the Amoraic period in the time of the Gemara. And he goes into this kind of whole weird convoluted explanation about why it is that the Torah told a modeh b'mikzat, right, that the Torah said that this modeh b'mikzat has to take an oath. Right? When we saw it said ki hu zeh, and we're like, actually, that's about a totally different thing. It's about a mildah. The question becomes sort of why? What's the biblical rationale for this? Because as opposed to with Shevuot HaShomrim, where we saw several full psukim that explain the story and what's happening and why, right? The Torah only gives us 3 words about modeh b'mikzat according to the rabbinic tradition, ki hu zeh, and so Rabbah has to explain a whole story for us. And it's already in its own right confusing. Wait till you one day get to learn what Tosfot has to say about it, which is that it's even more confusing than we think, but not for now. Do we have a volunteer perhaps to read this Divrei Rabbah?
I can read. I'm still
Okay.
muted.
Amazing. You're still reading. Thanks. Okay, Emily.
Amar Rava, mipnei ma amra Torah modeh b'mikzat hata'ana b'mikzat hata'ana yishava
Yishava.
chazaka ein adam me'iz panav b'fnei ba'al chovo v'hai b'chulei.
Wait, let's just stop there for a second to read the translation, and then we'll. Okay.
For what reason did the Torah say that one who admits to a part of the claim must take an oath? It is because there is a presumption that a person does not exhibit insolence by lying in the presence of his creditor.
Okay, so that doesn't fully explain it yet, meaning he's going to have to kind of build this narrative. But we're starting with a baseline assumption about human psychology, says Rabbah, which is we have this presumption a person doesn't exhibit insolence in the presence of his creditor, which is to say he's not going to flat out lie to his creditor's face. There are a couple different ways that that people understand exactly what that means, but let's say, yeah, I'm not going to flat out lie in the face of a person who lent me money. Okay. And because of that, then what happens? V'hai
b'chulei ba'i dinechafri.
There's some Aramaic. I appreciate the courage there.
Dinechafri. V'hai to look
Kafre.
Mishum de'ein adam me'iz panav. B'chulei ba'i
Lo delay. Lo delay is lehodot lo, to admit to him.
Lo delay. V'hai de kapar le b'mikzat savar. I
modina le bechule.
I modina le bechule tavali bechule. Ishtamit le mihu hashta adavai li zuze ufrana.
Okay, so let's just do that part in English. That'll hopefully make sense of it. Okay.
And this person actually wants to deny all the debt. And the fact that he does not deny all of it is because a person does not exhibit insolence. And in order not to exhibit insolence, he wants to admit to the creditor with regard to all the debt. And the fact that he denies owing him in part is because he reasons, if I admit to him with regard to all of the debt, he will lodge a claim against me with regard to all of it. I will evade him, at least for now, until I have money, and then I will pay him all of it.
Okay, so what's happening here, right? I borrowed money from I borrowed money from Emily, and now she's coming to me to say, where's my money? I unfortunately have spent a whole bunch of it and don't have very much to pay her back. But I can't say, what are you talking about? I've never met you, because we have this presumption that I won't exhibit insolence in the presence of my creditor, which is to say, to flat out lie to your face is something that I'm not a bad person, right? As I'm not trying to, right? I don't have the money to pay you back, and if I admit to owing you all of it, I'm toast, you know. So I figure, okay, I'll hold her off for a little while. I'll kind of mess with her head a little bit. I'll say that perhaps I act like she doesn't remember exactly how much I owe her, so I'll give her an amount that's less than that, and then I'll pay her that, and then in the meantime, I'll win back all the money I lost in the lottery, and then I'll or gambling or whatever it is, and then I'll eventually pay you back. That's the kind of psychological narrative that Rabbah is constructing about what's happening in the head of this defendant, and therefore says Rabbah, Hilkach, you wanna. I'll just read the last line also because there's a lot of Aramaic here. Right, Hilkach Rama Rachmana Shivwai Lave Kihechi Delodi Levechule. Right, therefore, God, or the merciful one, imposes an oath upon him, such that, right, or so that, in order to ensure that he will admit to him with regard to all of the debt, which is to say, I'm not a bad enough person to swear. I'm a bad enough person to lie, but I'm not a bad enough person to swear falsely. And once I know that I'm going to have to take an oath about this, then I'm going to actually, instead of taking that oath, I'm going to admit it, and I'm going to pay back all of it. Okay, so let's go back to kind of our questions that we were asking and see how they map onto this case, the case of Modev Mikzah, which even if you don't necessarily buy Rabbah's entire picture of the back and forth with psychology, right? We realize something with regard to the relationship between the plaintiff's claim on the one hand and the defendant's on the other. So what's the strength of the plaintiff's claim, right? The person who lent the money, theoretically, right? He knows what he lent, right? He knows how much money he's owed. He may have forgotten, or it may be possible to mess with his head, but it's not not Shema the way that the Shevuot Shomrim was, right? I know what I lent. Is there a real dispute about the facts of the case? Yes. Someone claims I owe you $100,000, and someone claims no, it's only 50, right? Like that's for two real different accounts of the loan. And I think especially now that we have Rabbah's picture, right, is there a baseline presumption that the defendant is telling the truth? I think in this case, the answer to that question really is no. We think he's being evasive. And we think that the point of the Shevuah, right, is not to, right, the Shevuah itself is not a way for him to be believed and right by the other party, but is actually a way to convince, or is a way to compel him to change his mind and tell the truth. Right? So, right, what we have here are really two different pictures. Not only of the particular case in which the oath is being taken, but actually fundamentally different ideas of what the oath is and is meant to accomplish. And okay, I think with that, I want us to go back for a second to the Psukim and to see that actually once we have those two different pictures in our mind, I think we have perhaps a better understanding of why it is that Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef maybe thought, hey, Pasuk Chet doesn't really belong here. And that's because, right, I think when we look at, right, the way that we broke down the idea behind the oath and the purpose that it's supposed to play, Pasuk Chet actually looks a little bit different than what's happening in Psukim, Vav Zayin on the one hand and Tet Yod on the other. Right, we saw in Tet Yod, the biblical narrator is describing the case as, right, what happened is nishba in roeh. Similarly, in Pasuk Vav, what's happening is, right, it gunav mi beit ha'ish, it got stolen. and we find the owner, we don't find the owner. In both cases, we see, right, Nikrav Abayit El HaElohim, even if it's not explicitly an oath, right, he's going to claim Im Lo Shalach Yado B'Mlechet Re'ehu, right, to claim that he didn't do, right, like, to claim that he in fact is innocent. And we see that similarly happening in Psukim Ted and Yud, right? He's taking this oath if he didn't shalach yad, im lo shalach yad b'mlechet re'ehu. We see that phrase kind of both times. In both cases, the way that the biblical narrator is narrating the story is sort of starting with the thing that the defendant is claiming happened, in fact, actually happened. We see at the end of Pasuk Yud, lakach ba'alav v'lo yishalem. The assumption is he takes the oath, goes home, everything's good. Whereas what's happening in Pasuk Chet, all of a sudden, we're not so sure anymore, right? We see, and it's funny because here it does, right? We see all these objects, and then, right, what we see is kol davar asher yomar ki hu zeh, right? About all these things which he says ki hu zeh. And remember when we saw back to that Midrash Halacha, right? We were like, what does this have to do with modem miktzat? Sure, but what we saw there is there's an actual, right? One person is saying, this thing is mine, and the other person is saying, no, this thing is not yours, right? There's a real dispute as to something fundamental, to a fact about the case. The two of them, the Devar Shnehem, right, their matter of conflict is going to Elohim, whether it's the judges or whether it's God. And then what we see is there's one person who is in fact going to be found guilty, and the other is going to be found innocent. Right, the picture that's happening in Perek Chet is one in which there's real conflict, and the conflict resolution happens via getting at the truth in some way, which is different than the cases, right, the case above and the case below, where what's happening isn't really conflict. And the point of this oath, or the point of going forth to the kind of judicial to the judicial system, is really about a much lower grade of conflict resolution. I would say it's not about figuring out the truth as much as it's about kind of achieving some kind of reconciliation or the piyus dat, as the lefayes da'ato shel bal habayit, right? Allowing the claimant or the person who ends up losing out to sleep easier at night, right? So as we see, right, what's the purpose of each of these oaths? On the one hand, right, we have Shevuot Modeh Miktzat is getting the guilty party to confess, and ultimately, right, in getting the guilty party to confess, and ultimately getting justice done in a case of real conflict. Whereas what's happening in Shevuot HaShomrim is really about restoring trust between two parties. And I think when we take a step back and think about this, I think this kind of gives us maybe a broader picture of like what we're doing when we go to the justice system as a way of dealing with our conflicts, right? Sometimes we really need to understand the truth of what happened, and sometimes what we're placing our trust in a third party because we think that they will do a better job than we can of determining the truth and of doing justice in that sense. And I think there's really a way to think about the role of the legal system as human beings are in conflict with one another, and they lie and they steal and they cheat, and we have to figure it out to make sure that the bad guys get their comeuppance and that the good guys get stuff restored to them. And there's another way of thinking about it that kind of ultimately rests on the idea that people want to do the right thing, more or less are good people, but don't always have but don't always fully trust each other, don't always aren't fully able to rely on one another, and sometimes the appeal to third parties. But I think here it's actually interesting that there's ambiguity even in the biblical text about whether what we're talking about is God or whether what we're talking about is the court, because right, those two systems are actually very much intertwined in the biblical and even rabbinic imagination. Right, the very fact that we're taking oaths to God in court, right, is I think an indicator of that. But that the assumption that another person is a God-fearing man and or man or woman, and when they take an oath that they'll do so truthfully, right? That allows us to trust one another more, and to kind of deal with one another in a way that that just kind of allows us to build a society in which we can really, really rely on one another. So yeah, with that, I think we'll call it for tonight here. I'm gonna unshare my screen for a second just because I wanna see you all before I bid you goodbye. This has been a really fun and invigorating 5 weeks for me, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to learn with all of you throughout. I also, yeah, I'm really impressed with the group of people that's following Mishnah Yomit. I think learning Mishnah is one of those things that it's sometimes, I think it's the payoff is like kind of unbelievable in the long run, just in terms of the set of like rabbinic concepts that one can become familiar with in a short span of time. It's sometimes doesn't necessarily feel as fun as I think certain other kinds of learning, but I think there's just something that gives it there's something about the breadth, and I think I hope that together we've been able to kind of understand that there's actually a lot of depth there as well, and that we've really had the opportunity to think about kind of fundamental questions about the nature of law, the nature of our relationship to speech, the mitzvot, and how all those things can interact with one another in building the society that the Torah is imagining. So yeah, thank you so much. And a huge thank you to Kayla also for organizing all of this and making all of this possible.
Thank you.
Purim Sameach.
Purim
Coming up
Sameach.
soon.
Thank you everyone for coming and learning these
Thank
past 5
you.
weeks. And I would like to remind people again that if you are continuing with Mishnah Yomi, we are continuing with Mishnah Yomi as well, with Eduyot starting on March 17th, moving to Tuesday nights at 8 p.m., where we have the pleasure of learning with Dr. Yitz Landis for the next few weeks. And with that,
I've had the pleasure of hearing from him a couple of times. He's amazing. I highly recommend.
and with that, Purim Sameach, and be well.
Thank you.